to lesson 3 of our PMP certification training. Once again, my name is Obalim and I'm going to be your anchor person. So in this lesson 3, we shall be taking a look at project integration management. This is a little bit of overview of some of the things we've discussed in the previous lessons. Remember, in the previous lessons, we discussed the fact that in PMI's project management methodology, there are 10 knowledge areas. So these 10 knowledge areas, remember we said is core creeps. So this 10 knowledge area includes integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, and then stakeholders. So we're going to be taking a look at the very first knowledge area, which is project integration management. So under the integration management knowledge area, we shall define what project integration management is all about. Then we shall also identify the key role of the project manager, as well as the project team, as well as the project sponsor when it comes to project. Then we shall also explain the various project selection methods, and then describe project integration management processes, and then identify key terminologies that are used in project integration management. So these are some of the things we shall be discussing in this particular lesson. So first of all, let's talk about integration. So integration basically means to bring together, to combine, to unify. So that's why we'll talk about integration, and we said that it includes processes and activities to identify, define, combine, unify, and coordinate the various processes and project management activities. So in essence, when we talk about project integration, we're basically talking about bringing together all the various project management processes and then activities, and then of course using them for the purpose of the project management. So ordinarily, I would have loved the integration management knowledge area to be the very last knowledge area. The reason is this, because most of the outputs that you're going to be seeing that will form input in this process will be output from other processes, which of course we're yet to talk about. So which is also part of the reason why I recommended earlier on that in this lesson you try and watch this video at least 2 times, so it will actually to a large extent help you to fully understand exactly what we are talking about. So when we talk about integration, basically this is a high-level work that requires the project manager to manage interdependencies among the other knowledge areas. So in essence, this is where the project manager basically combines all the functions that we have in the other knowledge areas. So it deals with resource allocation, and then also balancing complex demands, examining alternatives, and then tailoring processes to work within organization as well as project needs, as well as managing the interdependencies among project management knowledge areas. So as much as possible, all of these are part of the things that we do under project integration management. If you notice earlier on when I was showing you the table, I told that integration management is the only knowledge area where you have processes in it cutting across the 5 process groups. So that's why we said that integration ensures continuity across multiple, knowledge areas. Because like I mentioned earlier on, integration is where we bring together everything that we do in the course of the project implementation. So when it comes to project, typically this is the way project management team is usually organized. So at the top, we have what we refer to as the project sponsor. So the project sponsor sometimes can also be referred to as the financier. This is basically the person who pays for the project. So the key role of the project sponsor is to protect the project team from unnecessary changes as well as loss of resources. So in essence, the project sponsor provides the finances, and then aside from that, also ensure that as much as possible, the project is on its right course throughout the project implementation. And then you now have the project management office, which of course, remember, as we defined it in the previous lesson, that the project management office is a unit or a department that oversees the management of projects in the organization. So this is basically what project management office here now refers to. And then you now have the project manager. So the project manager like we mentioned earlier on, is the primary integrator. So the project manager is the person who integrates various activities of the project to pull all the pieces of the project together into a cohesive whole. And then you now have the project team. So the key role of the project team is to concentrate on completing the project activities, and that's one key thing the project team does. So if you take a look at what we have done so far, you will notice that typically in an organization, when there is need for an initiative or a project, so you may have a situation where the project sponsor does a mandate and then sends the mandate to the project management office. So the project management office will review the mandate and then be able to determine the appropriateness of the project by doing what we refer to as the business case, the benefit management plan, and then also drawing up what we refer to as the SOW. Of course, if you don't remember pre-project activities, I suggest you still watch lesson 2. This is where I explained pre-project activities, or activities that take place before the project. So all of these are done at the level of the PMO. So the PMO now determines the importance thereof of that particular project and then issues a project charter appointing you as a project manager to now oversee the implementation of this project. And then you may also have a situation where the PMO also appoints the project team. So if the PMO appoints the project team, we refer to that as pre-assignment. In other words, they appoint you as a project manager, and then they will now tell you, okay, you're going to work with these key resources to be able to carry out the project. That's what we refer to as pre-assignment. Aside from that, you may have a situation where after you've been appointed as a project manager, you will now be saddled the responsibility of appointing or constituting your project team. So in that case, you can also have a situation where the project manager is responsible for constituting or bringing together the project team. So if that's the case, of course, it simply means that the project manager is now the person who eventually appointed the project team. So from what we have said so far, if you notice, authorities are granted from top down, from the sponsor to the project management office, and then of course to the project manager, and then to the project team. So in the course of the project implementation, now notice what happens. Like I explained earlier on, the sponsor provides the finance or the funding needed for the project implementation. Then the PMO will be responsible for giving direction. So the PMO will be responsible for giving direction with regards to this particular project. Then the project manager, just like the name sounds, will be responsible for managing the project. And then, of course, the project team will now be responsible for the deliverables. So this is basically the various roles that team plays within a particular project. So the sponsor, like we mentioned earlier on, provides the funding. Then the PMO takes that, or rather gives direction where the need arises. The project manager is responsible for managing the day-to-day running of the project, and the team is responsible for the deliverables. So when the authority or the mandate comes from the project sponsor to the PMO, like I said, issues a project charter and then appoints the project manager, who in turn may now set up the project team. So the project manager will now be sending what we refer to as work packages to the team to carry out. And then, of course, when the work packages are completed, what happens? The project team sends the report back to the project manager on completed work packages. And then, of course, don't forget that the project manager also reports back to the project management office on the status of the project. And the project management office also intermittently reports to the project sponsor, giving an overview as exactly where the project is at that particular point in time. Aside from that, we also have what we refer to as escalations. Beyond escalations as well, other things that can also go upwards can also include what we refer to as exceptions. So if, for example, the team runs into trouble, what do? They escalate to the project manager. Or if they forecast that they are going to reasonably exceed their limits, they will also raise an exception and then, of course, send forth to the project manager. And then the project manager also liaises with the project management office if the project manager also needs to escalate, needs advice, and then also needs to exceed certain exceptions. The project manager escalates to the project management office. So all of this is essentially how the whole of the project, roles interact, especially within a given project management organization. So aside from this, we're now going to take a look at the processes that we have under project integration management. So this is where we are. We are in the very first knowledge area. So under the project integration management knowledge area, there are 7 processes here. And the 7 processes we have under integration are, we have the develop project charter, then the develop project management plan, the direct and manage project work, the manage project knowledge, monitor and control project work, the perform integrated change control, and then close project or phase. So these are the processes we have under project integration management, 7 of them. So I usually like as much as possible to let my candidates understand that for each of these knowledge areas, the processes in them do not stand in isolation. So what I mean by that is that to a large extent, these processes are logically related, and I'm going to explain that. Let's say, for example, we want to carry out a project, and the project is that we want to hold a retreat. We want to hold a retreat for our staff members or people who work within our organization. One of the very first things we might do as an organization, if you take a look from the different roles that I described in the very last session, one of the first things we might first of all do is to appoint a project manager. And how do we appoint a project manager? Simply by issuing a project charter. So once we've been able to appoint a project manager for this retreat, so let's say you, the viewer of this particular lesson, is appointed the project manager for this particular retreat, which is the project that we're about to do. Typically, what will be the next thing you will do logically? Of course, the next thing you're most likely going to do is you begin preparation, which is basically where planning comes in. You begin to now make estimates as per logistics, venue for the retreat, activities that will take place in the retreat, the cost of the retreat, and then of course every other detail, including the food, including the schedule, including speakers, including every other thing that would happen in the course of the retreat, the travel arrangements. All of this will be figured out. So you can see we have the develop project charter where the project manager, you are appointed as the project manager. And then after that, the next thing you did was you started creating a plan as to how to be able to achieve this very objective. So once you're done with the plan, what will be the next thing you do? The next thing you might possibly do is get the plan approved. And then once you get the plan approved, you probably now hold a kickoff meeting, which of course will formally mark the commencement of the implementation or the execution of that particular project. So in essence, once the plan is approved, you now begin to assign work packages to various resources that you have within that particular project. So in essence, this is where as a project manager, you now begin to allocate work to your project team, members, like we saw in the last slide. So once that is the case, that's what we refer to as the direct and managed project work. So during the direct and managed project work, just like the name sounds, you are directing, giving instruction, assigning job functions, assigning work packages, and then expecting that the team does it and give you feedback. All of that is what you do during the direct and managed project work. So remember again, we're holding a retreat. You were appointed as a project manager and you were issued a project charter. Now, with the charter, you were appointed as a project manager and you went straight into developing the plan. And then when the plan is ready, you went straight into execution by now giving directions, assigning work packages, and then of course getting the team to carry out the functions within those work packages. In addition, PMI is now saying that as those work are being done, there is a need for you to do what we refer to as managed project knowledge. Managed project knowledge simply means capturing lessons learned in the course of the project implementation. So you need to continually let your team know why it is important that they should capture the lessons learned within the project. And then not just that, this will help you to build consistent increase in your project implementation. And that's exactly what managed project knowledge here refers to. So in addition to this, notice that when the team members now begin to carry out the function, the day-to-day activities or implementation of the project, what do? You don't just wait until they finish everything before you now say, okay, we are done. No, you keep on checking what they are doing. Say, for example, the person who is assigned to book flights, you'll be able to keep track and be able to determine if this person has carried out this function, and then also, is it within the budget that was approved? Accommodation, is it within the budget? The hotel bills, the hotel accommodation, is it higher than what we have in the budget, or is it within the budget? Eventually, when we go for the retreat and people are complaining, for example, that they don't have a comfortable room, is it something you can check and then be able to make requests that such rooms be changed and all of that? This is what you do during the monitor and control project work. Basically, you're now checking what is happening in the course of the project implementation to make sure that it's in line with what you have in the plan, and then address any variation that may arise accordingly. Now, when there is now a need to perform changes, you now pass it through a controlled change procedure, which is what the process the PMI now refers to as the Perform Integrated Change Control. So in essence, the Perform Integrated Change Control simply refers to the processes involved in carrying out changes in the project. That is, if at all there is a need to implement changes. So let's assume that in the course of this retreat, we got to a point where we discover that there is a need to, we discover that some of our staff members who are going for this retreat are vegetarians or they are vegans, as the case may be. And hitherto, the plan for the meals does not capture that, requirement. So if we now get to learn of that requirement along the line, we're probably not going to just unilaterally, as a project manager, just change the menu or change the plan for the meals as already contained in the project management plan. So what you're going to do at that particular point in time will now be to raise what we refer to as a change request, and then send the change request to the appropriate body to approve, so that you will be able to include this new requirement into your plan, so that at the end of the day, every other individual whose requirement we have within this project would have been addressed sufficiently. So to be able to do that, remember, one key thing I mentioned was you need to do what we refer to as assessment of the impact. So you need to assess the impact of the change that is being proposed. So in this case, they are proposing that we add a menu for vegetarians within our menu lineup. So we need to be able to assess what the impact would be on our costs, and then also how would it affect our schedule, then also how would it affect other variables like the scope of the project as well as the quality of the project. And then also we might even take a look at what we refer to as customer satisfaction. And then beyond that, we might also want to consider if it will lead to increased risk. So these are the various factors against which we can actually subject the proposed change. And then, of course, the outcome of that will now help us to be able to fully determine what next to do. So if the change is approved, then of course you need to go back to your plan and update your plan, and then you do your implementation again. So once you're done with all of this, let's say we have now gone for the retreat and we're able to successfully complete it, and then we're back. What is expected of you naturally? You'll be expected to do a report about the success or otherwise of the retreat, and then also beyond that, you might also be expected to also give us a total breakdown of the financial expenditure, and then also the lessons that you learned in the course of this particular project implementation. So all of this is what we refer to as the close project or phase. So this is where you typically bring the project to an end, release your team, then of course do what we refer to as a final report, and then also archive your project documents. So you can see how all of these processes interrelate. Like I mentioned earlier on, there's really no process that stands in isolation. So one way or the other, you notice that all of the processes that we discuss under integration are fully related to one another. So remember, like we said earlier on, that part of the things we do, When under project integration management, we said that there are 7 processes, and then the 7 processes we have under integration management are, first of all, we develop the project charter, where we came up with the document that appoints the project manager and authorizes the project. And then also we develop the project management plan, where we come up with the document that will serve as a guide that will enable us to be able to carry out the project implementation. Then with the plan, we now begin to direct and manage project work, as well as managing project knowledge by documenting lessons learned. And then beyond that, we also monitor and control project work. Monitor and control project work is where we effectively check to be able to determine that what is being implemented is in line with what we have in the plan. And then if there is a need to carry out any change, we now perform integrated change control. And then once the project is done, you bring it to an end, which is what we refer to as the close project or phase. Okay, so notice that we're going to take a look at each of these processes one after the other. If you remember, in the last lesson, we talked about what we refer to as the ITTO. ITTO simply stands for input, tools and techniques, and then output. And remember, I mentioned that ITTO, which is the input, tools and techniques and output, simply illustrates the fact that every process will have an input, tools and techniques, as well as output, and we're going to be taking a look at them one after the other. But before we do that, I want to do a quick recap of some of the things I mentioned in the previous lesson. Remember, in that lesson, I talked about the fact that we have what we refer to as pre-project activities. So the pre-project activities are basically the activities that take place before the project. And then I mentioned that part of the things we do, if there is a need, I remember I said that need can either be a problem or an opportunity. So I said once a need is established in the need for us to carry out a project, that one of the very first things we need to do is we do what we refer to as the business case. So the business case now gives us a justification. In other words, it tells us if it makes sense from a business standpoint to address this need or to solve this problem or take advantage of the opportunity. So once we've been able to do that, that is the business case, then the next thing we are now going to do is we do a BMP, which is the benefit management plan, where we capture the benefits inherent in that particular project. And that's what the BMP or the benefit management plan will now capture. So this is where you capture the expected benefits that the project will deliver. So once you've been able to capture this expected benefit, the next thing that we typically do pre-project will now be coming up with what we refer to as solution options. So solution options now refers to various ways we can address this need. And that's basically where the solution options come in. And then after we've now come up with the solution options, we now select a particular solution. Notice that this selection will be based on the outcome of a feasibility, which of course would be conducted to be able to determine the viability of the solution option that we are going to be selecting. So when we now select a particular option to implement, then we draw up what we refer to as the statement of work, which is the SOW. And remember, I mentioned that this SOW is a narrative description of the product from a high level that the project will produce. And then once the SOW is ready, I now talked about the fact that this way you now bring in the project manager to make this a reality. And then to do that, you simply begin by issuing a project charter, which will mark the initiating of the project. And then, of course, the project manager now goes ahead to develop the plan. And then there is now the executing processes. And at the end of the project, you have what we refer to as the closing, where the project is brought to an end. Remember, we mentioned that the monitoring and controlling will take place throughout the project implementation. So that's why you're seeing this monitoring and controlling. And as the project progresses from the initiating to the closing, of course, time elapses. So that's why we refer to this as our time axis. And then also this is our cost axis. So cost is usually highest at the execution of the project. Now, why am I referring to this again? I'm referring to this again because for us to perform our very first process, which is the develop project charter, there are certain things that will go into the development of the project charter. So the things that will go into the development of the project charter are those documents that we develop pre-project. In other words, the documents that we develop before the project commenced. These are the documents that will now form input in the develop project charter process. So in essence, during the develop project charter process, we would include our business case, our benefit management plan, then of course other project documents including the needs document as well as the SOW, as well as other agreements that will as much as possible govern the operation of that particular project. Then also there are two common inputs that I mentioned, which are the enterprise environmental factors as well as the organizational process assets. So these are the things you're going to be seeing as inputs in the develop project charter process, which is the very first process we're going to be talking about. However, before we talk about that particular process, first of all, I want us to be able to interpret this very process map. So notice that we're going to be showing you something like this in the course of the training. So what that simply means is, anytime you see something like this, the item in the middle is the process that we're talking about. Then the ones you're seeing here on the right represents the inputs. So these are inputs that are coming in or things that we require to carry out this process. Then the ones you're seeing here represents the tools and the techniques. And then, of course, what you now see here by the right-hand side represents the output. So this is essentially how to read this process diagram. So, of course, when we begin to show them, you'll be able to make sense of them. So remember we said that the very first process is the develop project charter process. So the develop project charter process is basically the process where we develop the document that formally authorizes the existence of the project. So if you remember what we said earlier on, that the project charter is the document that formally authorizes the project and then provides the project manager with the authority to apply organizational resources to the project activities. So it belongs to the initiating process group. So the develop project charter, like I mentioned, authorizes the project. And if you notice from the last illustration I made, I told you the inputs to develop project charter. In other words, these are more like the documents we can refer to give us ideas about what should be contained within our project charter. So of course, they will include typically most of those pre-project documents, including your benefit management plan, wherein you already have the expected benefits that the project will deliver. Then your business case. Remember we said that the business case is the justification. So this is the document that gives us a justification for the project implementation. Then also agreements. These agreements will now include either pre-contractual agreement or agreements that exist prior to this particular project. Then of course your enterprise environmental factors, which are factors that are not within your control. So you need to put that also into consideration when you're developing the charter. Say for example, you have a situation where within a particular industry there's an SOP, there's a standard procedure for the project charter development. So if that's the case, it only makes sense that you follow the standard procedure, and that's what the enterprise environmental factors now refers to, as well as organizational process assets. So remember we said organizational process assets are things of value owned by the organization that can aid the process implementation. So in this case, the organizational process assets can include previous project charter. Then also aside from that, we can also use project charter templates. All of these are things that will form input in the develop project charter process. Please, again, you may want to refer back to the previous lesson to be able to understand what we mean by ITTO. I explained them typically when I was talking about the meaning of a process, and then I gave instances when I used the baking example and all of that. So that's also what is happening here. So for us to be able to perform every process, we need inputs, more like the process triggers. And then we now need the tools and the techniques, which are the transforming agents. So in essence, all of these inputs that I've mentioned here, they will now be combined or put together using these tools and techniques, which of course would include expert judgment. So it simply means that to develop the project charter, we can basically call for the opinion of subject matter experts to help us in developing the project charter. And then we can also gather data. Aside from that, we can also hold meetings and via a brainstorming session be able to come up with this charter. And then in the course of the meeting, you're going to need interpersonal as well as team skills to be able to effectively conduct or carry out the meetings, and then of course to be able to drive the meeting to a desired end. All of these are part of the things you do during part of the tools and the techniques. So these are the tools and the techniques that are required during the develop project charter process. So the output of the develop project charter process will now give us the project charter. In other words, So in other words, by the time we are done with the process of develop project charter, the result or the output we'll get is the project charter. And then of course, you also have assumption log where you document assumptions that you may have encountered in the project. And that's exactly where the assumption log comes in. So the project charter, like I mentioned, is basically where we create the vision and goals for the project, and then also make sure that we get our project sponsor as well as stakeholders agreement. So part of the things that you see typically in the project charter would include the purpose, vision, as well as the initial scope for the project, and then also the authority of the project manager. It might also contain the business problem to be solved, then measurable project objectives as well as requirements, project boundaries and key deliverables, the risk, critical success factors, then also a list of your stakeholders as well as their roles and responsibilities, constraints and assumptions that has been identified on a high level, and then also project exit criteria as well as approval of the project sponsor. These are the key elements of the project charter. So this is quite necessary because sometimes in the exam you see questions that talks about the elements or things that are contained within the project charter. So typically these are some of the things you see within the project charter. Okay, good. So let's take a look at this particular task. So you refer to your student workbook and then you're going to see this very task there. So it says CL Consulting has asked you to develop a project charter for the tax mobile app development. Don't forget, in the previous lesson, we made reference to the fact that we have a sample project which we are using for the purpose of this illustration, which is of course the development of an app for tax collection. So it is still that same project that we are carrying along even up until this very exercise. So CL Consulting has asked you to develop a project charter for the tax mobile app development. You have also been given the authority to make suggestions on what the charter should contain based on your experience. So you're asked to use the template provided to complete a brief charter. So use the template that is provided in this exercise to complete the project charter for this particular task. So you can pause the video while you work on this very task. Okay, welcome back. So notice that within the project charter that you probably have worked on, you notice that there are a whole lot of things that you saw there, which of course can include the project title, then of course the project manager, then also you talk about the project objectives, and then aside from that, the authorities of the project manager as well as responsibilities. And there is also a portion that talks about the stakeholders who might be involved in this project. Then also high level risk also was identified. Then the project scope, cost as well as time. All of these are part of the things that are typically contained within the project charter. So once the charter is ready, the next thing you now need to do is to develop the project management plan. The project management plan is now the document that will serve as the guideline, the baseline for the project implementation. And that's exactly what we do with the project management plan. So to be able to develop the project management plan, this is basically where we combine all the other subsidiary plans within the project, and that's exactly what the project management plan is. So that's why we say that the developed project management plan is the process of defining, preparing, integrating, and coordinating all subsidiary plans, as well as integrating them into a comprehensive project management plan. So adding together all subsidiary plans and then putting them together into the project management plan, that's exactly what happens during the develop project management plan process. So the project management plan is a detailed document that describes how the project would be executed, monitored, as well as controlled and closed. So everything that will have to be done in the project is contained within the project management plan. And then of course, the project management plan contains all the subsidiary plans as well as their baseline values. So performance measurements baselines of project time is the total project baseline time and the agreed time variance. So subsidiary plans can be separate documents, particularly on very large projects. So you may have a situation where you have a very large project, and if that's the case, some of those subsidiary documents or subsidiary plans can actually be a separate document. Other than that, don't forget that your subsidiary plans can also be integrated into the project management plan itself. So we said that if the initial agreed time for a project is 180 days, it is the project baseline time value. In other words, this is basically the basis upon which we are now going to compare the project implementation. So if the agreed variance is 10%, the project should be executed within a maximum of 180 days plus 10% of it, which is of course 198 days in total. So like I mentioned earlier on, remember we mentioned that the project management plan is nothing other than a combination of other subsidiary plans. So these are some of the contents of the developed project management plan. So the project management plan, of course, would include what we refer to as the project charter. So the project charter that you developed in the last exercise will also be required in the developed project management plan process, because, I mean, the project charter here is more like now the is like the high level plan, and then of course will now be captured within the project management plan itself. It will also contain the project management approach or strategy, then your scope management plan, your requirements management plan. So both the scope management plan and requirements management plan are outputs that we get when we plan scope, which of course we are going to see much more later. So the scope management plan will talk about how you're going to validate your scope, how you're going to control your scope, how you're going to create your work breakdown structure. All of these are what your scope management plan will capture, while your requirements management plan will capture how you're going to gather requirements from your clients, and then how you will manage the life cycle of those requirements. Then it will also include the schedule management plan, which is of course the output you get when you plan schedule. So you can see, like I mentioned earlier on, all these subsidiary plans will form inputs in the developed project management plan. Then also part of the project management plan would include your cost management plan. Of course, you should already know where this cost management plan will come from. It will be the output of the plan cost process. And then of course your quality management plan, which is the output of the plan quality process. We're still going to see this later. Then also your resource management plan, which is the output of your plan resource management. And then also your communications management plan, which is of course the output of the plan communications process. Then your risk management plan, which is the output of the plan risk management process. Your procurement management plan, which is an output of your plan procurement management. Then your stakeholder management plan, which is the output of the plan stakeholder management. So all of these are now the subsidiary plans that will form part of the project management plan. Your project management plan can also include the change management plan, which is a document that captures how changes within the project has to be managed. Then also configuration management plan, which talks about how you're going to handle configuration items. These are items, artifacts, project artifacts that once you change them can affect the integrity of the whole of the project. Those are what we refer to as configuration items. So you should also have a plan as to how to manage such configuration items, and that's what your configuration management plan captures. Then also your scope baseline, schedule, as well as cost baseline. Then your performance measurement baseline, your project lifecycle description. So you're also going to state within your plan which project management lifecycle you're going to be using, which of course we discussed earlier on in the previous lessons, whether you're going to be using predictive or adaptive lifecycle, agile or iterative or incremental. All of these are specific types of life cycle that you may want to use, and it has to be captured within the plan. And then also your development approach. Development approach now talks about your iterations, your sprints, or your level of agility within the project. All of these are part of the things that make up your project management plan. So these are the things that now come together to a large extent, and like I mentioned earlier on, they now come together into what we now refer to as your project management plan. So if I ask you to list 5 reasons why you need a plan for a project, what will be your answer? So please see if you can write it down in your student workbook. List 5 reasons why you need a plan for a project. So you can pause this video and then do that particular exercise. All right, thank you. So remember again our ITTO, input, tools and techniques and output. So every process will have this. So let's now take a look at the ITTO for the developed project management plan. So you can see part of the input in the developed project management plan is the project charter. I mean, this shouldn't be surprising to you. Remember, we said earlier on that the project charter is part of the components or content of the project management plan. So that's why you're seeing the project charter as an input in the develop project management plan process. Then also output from other planning processes. So again, if we go back to the previous slide, all of these things you're seeing, remember when we plan scope, we got scope management plan and the requirement management plan. Then when we plan schedule, we got schedule management plan. All of these are outputs from, processes, other processes that we have, performed. So you can see these outputs are now part of what now formed input in the develop project management plan process. And remember we mentioned that both the EEF, that's the enterprise environmental factors, as well as the organizational process assets, both of them will form input in the develop project management plan process. So the enterprise environmental factor here are factors that are beyond our control. So in this case, they can include the fact that there is an industry regulation that governs how plans should be developed. Or aside from that, they'd also be predicated on the type of approach that you've selected. So the type of approach you've selected can also determine the type of, how you're going to go about your planning. For example, if you've chosen the waterfall methodology, which is the predictive approach, the predictive life cycle simply includes the fact that you have to have a detailed plan, while the same cannot be said for a progressive or an iterative or agile life cycle as the case may be. So that's one key thing you take a look at when you're talking about the enterprise environmental factors. Then also your organizational process assets, which of course now can include previous project management plans, and then aside from that, project management plan templates. So part of the tools and techniques that you need to develop the project management plan would include expert judgment. So in essence, we can bring in a subject matter expert to help us to develop the plan, or we gather information, do data gathering, and then also hold meeting to develop the plan. And then, of course, remember, in the course of the meeting, we're going to be needing interpersonal as well as team skills to effectively coordinate the meeting so that at the end of the day, we'll be able to achieve the objective, which is the development of the project management plan. So the output we're going to get at the end of this process is going to now be our project management plan. And the project management plan is now the document that will, to a large extent, serve as the guideline for the project implementation. And within it will be contained all the baselines that are required for the project success. So this is where we're going to be stopping in the part 1 of this particular lesson 3. So remember, here we took a look at the project integration management, and we said integration is where we combine, put it all together. And we also stated that under project integration management that there are 7 processes, which are the develop project charter, develop project management plan, the direct and manage project work, manage project knowledge, then also monitor and control project work, perform integrated change control, and then the close project or phase. And then so far we have taken a look at 2 out of those 7 processes, and the 2 processes we've talked about are the develop project charter as well as the develop project management plan. So when we come back in the part 2 of this particular series, we're now going to take a look at the other 5 processes that we have under the develop under the project integration management. So of course that would include the direct and manage project work, the monitor and control project work, the manage project knowledge, then also the perform integrated change control, as well as the close project or phase. All of these are part of what we're going to be discussing in the very next lesson. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. Once again, I want to thank you for listening and see you in the next